Yeah, sounds good. Because I can't see the chat, Rachel, are you okay with just like addressing whatever comes up? Okay, cool, sounds good. Okay, yeah, so I think we'll get started with our presentation. So welcome everyone, thank you for coming today. Rachel and I have been working on a research project for the past 3 months on community and reinvestments and the role of universities. And that is what we are going to be talking about today. So I am calling in from Edmonton, which is on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional meeting grounds, gathering place, and traveling route to the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakota Sioux. We acknowledge all of the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. And Rachel is calling in from the stolen homelands and traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And today these lands are known as Vancouver, where the UBC Vancouver campus is situated upon. And we were hoping that everyone who feels comfortable to do so could introduce themselves in the chat and maybe let us know where you're calling in from and what brings you here. And I think Rachel is going to send a link in the chat for a really helpful website to find out more about whose lands you're on if you are based in so-called North America. And you've possibly seen this website before, but it's a really cool resource. So for those of us, including myself, who are settlers and uninvited guests on the lands that we call home, I invite you to reflect on how you can center Indigenous sovereignty in your reflections and learning today, especially recognizing that the solutions to climate change must be rooted in justice and equity.
Thanks, Sarah. And feel free to do that anytime throughout today's session in the chat. We're just going to introduce ourselves really quickly. My name is Rachel. I use she, they pronouns. Happy to say I'm a recent UBC graduate finally. And I've also been organizing with Climate Justice UBC for the past 2 years under the guidance of Michelle, who is here today. And Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry, was I muted there? Okay, sorry about that. I am a 4th year environment and sustainability student at UBC. I am not quite graduated, but getting there. And Rachel and I met this semester doing a course in environmental geography. And I had a bit of an understanding of divestment before, but I didn't know a whole bunch about it. And I decided to work on this project with Rachel. And since then, I've learned a whole bunch and become really interested in the movement and really inspired. And that is where I'm at. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to maybe set a bit of context, our research is more specific to BC because both of us are students at the University of British Columbia. And so just to provide a brief timeline that's leading us to what we'll be discussing today around reinvestments. So UBC committed to fully divesting and also declared a climate emergency back in December 2019. In April 2020, the UBC Board of Governors published a legal opinion affirming that divestment should be implemented as part of their overall responsible investment strategy and announced plans to develop what they called a divestment plus strategy. This declaration was then followed by a decision to fully divest, basically presenting an opportunity for UBC to reinvest its endowment funds into climate solutions to advance racial and economic justice and strengthen community resilience. And in response, student group Climate Justice UBC published a list of recommendations to be incorporated into the divestment plus strategy, advocating for UBC to align its investments with its commitments to advancing climate justice and reconciliation. And among others, the recommendations entailed reallocating 5% of its assets to finance the transition to a low carbon economy, as well as to improve climate resilience within our communities. And so in February 2021, one of the meetings mentions UBC's commitment to pursuing reinvestment strategies that can be used to build back better. But as of now, the university has yet to allocate any funding or staff capacity or resources to develop concrete plans to implement such strategies. And so that really brings us to today. So for the past 3 months, Sarah, my research kind of looks into the potential for community reinvestments in BC and the role of universities in advancing and improving access to capital in the province through reinvestment efforts. And so to address this, we investigated how different stakeholders articulate community reinvestment as a concept or as a framework and operationalize it as a tool for transformative change. And in our literature review, Sarah and I found that student divestment campaigns typically do not define how or where capital should be reinvested. And we also found that there's really little literature that bridges the gap between community economic development and divestment, especially in Canada. But recently we have seen emerging calls by Climate Justice UBC as well as the Divest Canada Coalition to reinvest in our future, which shows that there's a growing appetite for reinvestment. And rightly so, we cannot be talking about climate justice and a just transition without discussing where money should be going, in whose hands, and how it should be distributed. And so for our research, we interviewed 10 participants from diverse backgrounds in the divestment campaigns, working within UBC, as well as within the field of social finance and community investing. And so we'll be presenting some key findings today. And we hope that that our research offers a starting point for both institutions and student campaigns looking to advance community reinvestments.
So that brings us on to what is community reinvestment. We included a definition here from the Moving Money Reinvestment Toolkit, which defines community reinvestments as investments that provide finances to people and organizations that do not have access to them otherwise due to the exclusionary nature of the financial services industry. But before we really get into it, what comes to mind when you think about community reinvestment? We were curious if you had any thoughts or like ideas, examples as to what community reinvestment is. So we'll give a quick second for some thoughts in the chat. So I think one thing that we found, and you can also, if you have any thoughts, just put them in the chat as we go along. But what we found, and the reason we kind of ask the question, is that while our interviewees differentiated the practice of community reinvestment from traditional forms of investing, there was no like absolute hard and fast definition for community reinvestment across organizations. And there's no like standardized framework for it. However, there were some common themes that emerged from our interviews to differentiate community investment from more traditional forms of investing. So for example, community investments need to clearly identify and define the community that they're addressing. So in doing so, you have to ask who constitutes community and who is being included and excluded and why. And as part of that, and as part of the community investment process, community agency and decision-making are priority and paramount. So community investments should also be designed to serve communities that are characteristically excluded from market mechanisms. And this sort of backed up what Rachel and I found in our literature review, which is just this general idea of community reinvestment. And also that general idea generally said that community investments typically bring in lower than market rate financial returns with an emphasis on social and environmental returns. So given the flexibility associated with the community investment framework, there is potentially room for corporate and institutional powers to exploit that framework in order to serve their own interests. Therefore, defining community investments for the purpose of the communities is important so as to prevent them from replicating hegemonic and exclusionary patterns of economic development. As for how community reinvestments are linked to climate justice, while divestment movements set broad goals for divestment from fossil fuels, community reinvestment as an endpoint is often less clearly defined or not defined at all. Divestment and reinvestment are two sides of the same coin, and we need to both fight the bad while building the new. Community reinvestment then poses a way for divestment campaigns to push for a shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And the Moving Money Reinvestment Toolkit defines a regenerative economy as one that is restorative to the people and to planet, builds community wealth, shifts economic control to the people, drives social equity, and centers the health and wealth of communities at its core. A campaign from the Climate Justice Alliance iterates that the climate and economic crises are fundamentally intertwined. Both are rooted in the ideology of extractivism, and they must therefore be collectively solved by reclaiming wealth and political power in a way that is restorative to communities and ecosystems. Furthermore, since the beginning of the pandemic, student groups across Canada have made calls for universities to reinvest endowment funds into climate solutions that advance racial, economic, environmental, and social justice in alignment with plans for a green and just economic recovery from COVID-19. Community reinvestments provide an avenue to respond to the social and environmental impacts, economic impacts of the pandemic, and to lead recovery and regeneration efforts across the country.
So the first question that Sarah and I were kind of looking to explore was what is the connection between universities and community reinvestment? And what is the role of universities in advancing community reinvestments? And so to start off, communities are anchor institutions. And what that means is that the university as an institution has a vested interest in the well-being of their local community. This concept suggests that universities are more likely to be productive and competitive if they're situated in a neighborhood with the conditions to foster the growth of social capital. For example, having good quality public transport, affordable housing, and social programs. And in turn, the growth and success of a university is likely to then draw more people and knowledge to the communities where it is situated, fostering the development of the university in an ongoing cycle of community-wide economic and social growth. Second, the social architecture of the corporatized university also means that university governing boards have a considerable degree of influence of the institution's positioning within civil society. And this is from the recognition that universities are not neutral market actors, but they're really profit-making corporations and investors as well. We have seen how universities have the power to cut ties with extractive industries through our divestment campaigns, and are similarly capable of leveraging its assets to meet community needs and advancing justice. It is clear that universities are not a passive force in the community investment discourse, but rather that they have a role in actively taking leadership and challenging mainstream investing beyond green growth and ESG paradigms. The third is that there's an increasing importance placed on the role of universities in fostering civic and community engagement to inform teaching, research, and learning. And stretching how we traditionally define engagement involves interrogating how university endowment funds should and can be situated to uphold their academic missions and to intentionally address social and economic inequities that exist in our communities in the face of a climate crisis. And the last is that community reinvestments can be a form of reparations. In the context of UBC, a portion of UBC's endowment is generated from land lease revenues earned from the development of new housing on UBC's land. And put differently, the accumulation of the university's wealth is the result of extraction from stolen traditional homelands of the Musqueam and First Nations. And so community reinvestments can act as reparations to showcase leadership and increase accountability. And this first requires us to critically ask who the university is accountable to. And so one of our main research questions was what key factors constitute successful community investment models. And we asked this question because we believe that they are vitally relevant to how success or impact should be measured or evaluated for community investment pathways, and also serve as guiding principles for institutions to embed within their reinvestment strategies. And so the first is community self-determination. Community reinvestment should be driven by communities to identify their long and short-term needs. It should also involve meaningful engagement and relationship building with community members rather than a top-down process. And it needs to emphasize equitable access for marginalized and historically excluded groups, especially those who have been systematically excluded from traditional financing mechanisms such as loans from big banks. Second, community building on both an institutional and community level. And what this means is that within institutions, Board of Governors needs to be aware and knowledgeable of the impacts of extractive economic practices, and to clearly understand the connection between the university's academic mission as well as the opportunities that community reinvestments present. Staff should also be well equipped to respond to needs on the ground. Something that was really interesting that came out in one of our interviews was that our interview mentioned how SFU is actually much better at responding to needs of communities than UBC. And I think this is very much reflected in the kind of university programming as well as allocation of budget during the past year, and even the strength of the student unions. And so asking questions about what kinds of events and support is your university providing in times of need is a really good reflection of how well a university is able to use community reinvestments to meet the community's needs. And on the local scale on the ground, we also need to develop the capacity of local institutions to receive and manage capital and in turn grow demand on the ground. And this involves asking whether local communities have knowledge of as well as access to financial tools that can actually accelerate and advance their goals. The third is partnerships. So community reinvestment should establish new or leverage existing partnerships with communities, especially Indigenous communities, as well as promote community ownership and driven developments, and to ambitiously explore alternative operational models, including joint ventures and cooperatives, as some folks have mentioned in the chat earlier. And lastly, institutional leadership. Institutional investors need to demonstrate leadership in reflecting climate justice principles in their investment policies and strategies. And they should also be working alongside the province, policymakers, and other local experts to advocate for regulatory changes in BC to facilitate and even mandate community reinvestments. With that said, community reinvestment is really not something revolutionary. Most universities already have the structures and frameworks in place to implement and execute it. And what we are really lacking is ambition and, dare I say, good investment managers. Sorry, Sarah, if you want to go to the next slide. At UBC, we have already developed really effective community engagement processes for the climate emergency, as well as the development of our Indigenous strategic plan. And just to kind of speak to that piece, the ISP alone received over 1,200 in-person engagements and over 15,000 individual submissions when we consulted with community around what they wanted to see in this plan. And the ISP also produced a performance measurement framework that can be used to align UBC's investments with the goals outlined in the report. And so we already have these frameworks to develop a really effective community investment strategy at UBC. And if you're not a student at UBC, I highly encourage you to look at what are the current goals and priorities of the universities and how you can align your own reinvestment campaign strategy to those goals. We also found that there were certain barriers to community reinvestment in BC, and one of them is fiduciary duty. So fiduciary duty poses a barrier to community reinvestment because they do not necessarily consistently perform according to the conventional financial metrics used to measure returns on investments and performance. And that's really because traditional interpretation of fiduciary duty do not account for long-term socio-economic well-being or even take into account climate risks. And this reiterates the need for us to shift our paradigm in the way that we measure economic growth, return on investments beyond profits and percentages, as well as how we conceptualize wealth. In the specific context of UBC as well, we are the first university in North America to commit to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we believe that if UBC were to explore community reinvestment options as under the guise of upholding their fiduciary duty to uphold its commitments to the Musqueam First Nations and to redress past and ongoing harm, that it could really set an important legal precedence for other institutions. The second barrier is that BC currently lacks a provincial framework and regulations to really push for community reinvestments on the ground. There's a huge policy void to incentivize or to mandate community reinvestments to improve access to capital. Canada is not as advanced as it is in the US with their Community Reinvestment Act and established community development financial institutions. But a few of our interviewees actually brought up that federal and provincial leaderships could intervene to mandate that a percentage of investments, of profits, or individual pension plans such as the RSP be invested into local economic development opportunities. A really interesting finding that came out during our research process was we spoke to someone from the BC Coalition for Community and Impact Investing. I believe that's the abbreviation. But they are currently developing a centralized investor management platform to build capacity and to showcase community investment options for investors. Right now, if you are looking for a particular ESG fund or say a renewable energy company to invest in, it's fairly easy, but this is not currently the case for community reinvestments. And so this centralized platform is really aiming to be able to do that for community reinvesting practices, as well as bringing people together who have experiences working in raising capital for local enterprises to share knowledge and to build capacity on the ground.
So as part of our research, we drafted a list of recommendations for UBC and for other universities to consider with their potential community reinvestment strategies moving forward. And the following are some of our recommendations. So first, the community reinvestment process needs to be defined on a case-to-case basis. And this is important because community reinvestment priorities need to be outlined according to the needs and members of the community that they are addressing, rather than like a top-down, more interventionist approach. And community investment should also be positioned to serve communities that are systemically excluded from traditional market mechanisms, as we've already kind of touched on. Next, community reinvestment efforts need to identify key stakeholders and community members and actively engage with those people in developing and establishing a community reinvestment framework. And that framework itself should incorporate guiding principles outlined in the key factors to consider section. So the factors that Rachel already talked about that constitute successful community investment models. And they should also include an impact measurement framework that accounts for non-economic metrics. It is imperative that the key goals and priorities in UBC's Indigenous Strategic Plan are meaningfully incorporated to inform criteria and evaluation metrics for the framework and potential reinvestment pathways. Finally, community reinvestment efforts should also include and establish extensive engagement plan that synthesizes and publicly reports on community input in order to best identify reinvestment pathways according to the needs identified by the community, and also to evaluate those community investments throughout time and to ensure that they're bringing in those environmental returns and social returns on top of just the financial returns.
Yeah, so what we found is really that there's no one model fits all. And as Sarah mentioned, it's really based on your local context, and decisions around what pathways and what models an investor should look into should be supported and informed by extensive community consultation, and in the case of UBC with the Musqueam community. And some suggestions that came up during the interviews included that UBC could potentially invest directly into a community-based financial institution such as a co-op, a credit union, or community bonds. They could create a revolving loan fund to provide unmatched funding for local project enterprises or capacity building on the ground. They could also finance community land trusts for affordable housing or agriculture to address food insecurity, as well as local procurement preferences for community and Indigenous owned businesses. A really interesting point that was brought up to us in one of our interviews was that through the community consultation processes for the Indigenous Strategic Plan was that folks are really keen to see more locally owned and even Musqueam run coffee shops or businesses on the UBC campus. And that constitutes a huge part of community investments as well. And so overall, these findings demonstrate the need for universities to implement community investment in BC to develop their own definition and processes. And we know that divestment movements play a significant role as well as have the power in shaping that. And we've witnessed this in climate justice UBC's success in getting UBC to divest and to declare a climate emergency. And so in terms of what can we do next to strengthen calls for reinvestment in our campaigns, to first launch your own community reinvestment campaigns. There are already resources on that, including the Raising Student Voices report in 2013, as well as the Moving Money Toolkit from the previous workshop that was recently released. The second is to develop or strengthen our theory of change to focus on building economic democracy and towards community reinvestment. And this should involve tying in with broader political organizing in your local communities. And so in Vancouver specifically, in the past year, there have been multiple organizations and campaigns that have been putting out calls to action for the City of Vancouver to redirect funds to repair harm and to build a community safety framework which prioritizes community programs and social services, and to essentially defund the police in response to increasing anti-Black and police violence. And so how can we as divestment organizers learn from and collaborate with local campaigns that align with our goals, and also to amplify their calls to action and be in solidarity with frontline resistance. And the last is really to bridge knowledge gaps. Through this research, I think Sarah and I really realized how little we know about finance and econ, which might make sense because it's not our area of study, but the knowledge around the technical aspects of community reinvestment is really, really helpful in understand potential pathways and their pros and cons, as well as previous case studies that can be leveraged and presented in our advocacy. And this can be done through knowledge sharing and building within our movements. And also there's a need to understand alternative economic models of ownership, governance, distribution of capital. So an example would be, how do co-ops work? What makes an effective co-op? What are community land trusts and how can they be funded and stuff like that. And the last is to understand legislation that governs such models. And something that we learned too is that in BC, there's no law to protect co-ops from being privatized, which is why MEC ended up started as a really good co-op model and then ended up being privatized. And so having knowledge around the legislation that governs such models also allow us to advocate for legislation to protect any solutions to put forward.
And that pretty much ties up where our research is at so far. So Rachel and I have been working on this for the past 3 months, and we're looking at working on it throughout the summer. So to kind of tie things up, we were curious, what is one thing that you took away from this workshop, and what is one thing that you would like to learn more about this topic or are curious about that we did not address today? So as we move forward in our research, we're really looking to kind of bridge some of those knowledge gaps that Rachel was just talking about, and then also just provide a piece of like a document or something that can be helpful to organizers who are looking to implement or ask for community reinvestment in their divestment campaigns. So really anything that comes to mind or that interests you or things you have questions about. And feel free to put those in the chat. And as well, we've put together a Google form, and we've also put together a sheet of resources. So just there's the Moving Money Reinvestment Toolkit in there and a few other helpful resources just for understanding community investments and understanding that landscape, both in the US and in Canada. So if you are interested in receiving these slides or that handout, please feel free to fill out the Google form. And also, if you are interested in getting in touch with us about our research, or if you have any thoughts or want to chat, we are very interested to talk about it. Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for listening. I'll hand it over to Rachel.
I mean, that's essentially it. I think we wanted to address a lot more within this research, but with just 3 months, it was a bit challenging. So I hope that these findings kind of offer a really good starting point. And if there's anything to take away, it's if you're still in school, use your classes to do investment research. Yeah, so thanks for listening. Yeah. Okay, I'm just reading comments in the chat. Had no idea. Yeah, Abby, that's a really good question. And I feel like, Sarah, feel free to jump in, and Michelle, you might have thoughts around this too. But with a lot of what they call an impact investing in the finance world, the priority is still very much profit. So even when you look at impact investing, they require a certain amount of market rate returns, or else those enterprises tend to not be prioritized, and that really limits who gets access to what we know as impact funds. I think.
One thing I would add on is I think like ESG investing and impact investing, we also found that it's just like so arbitrary in some cases, and it really depends on who the client is and what their like moral priorities are. And like I think we mentioned a couple times, like there's just no framework for actually measuring any of those returns. And we see all of this money that's going into the ESG track and that sort of thing, but it's a bit frustrating when we don't see like what that money is doing. So yeah, Rachel, if you have any more thoughts.
Yeah, I was just gonna say what you mentioned, it's absolutely right. There's no standardized framework even in measuring impact, or evaluating what impact is. And so it's really up to firms to determine that. And it's so oftentimes it's the priorities back to profit making rather than social economic well-being or local, or keeping capital locally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you both.
Michelle, I feel like you might have something to add to that.
No, I actually don't know that much about Raven. I know that it's like an impact investing vehicle for Indigenous owned businesses, but I don't know that much about like the businesses that they're actually invested in. So it might be considered community investment. Yeah, but I'd be interested in looking more into that. And I think it'll also depend on like the amount, right? So normally, I think Rachel mentioned that like we would say like 5% is a good amount for a campaign to like start asking for reinvestment. And I would imagine like SFUs, it's probably a lot less than 5% of their endowment.
Yeah,
so even if
based
they
on their
do
recent
have like
report.
one small investment in like something good, it's still like, not enough.
It's small, trust me, we looked.
I feel like too, I feel like community investments do not necessarily have to come after divestment. A lot of campaigns actually run them simultaneously depending on the capacity of your campaign. So there's definitely space to call for both at SFU.
As for the next question about bringing the community reinvestment to boards of governors and directors, Rachel, if you have any thoughts about this, feel free to jump in. But we're definitely in some ways struggling with that, trying to figure it out. We've talked about community reinvestments being incorporated into investment portfolios as a way of kind of diversifying risk. And we also have talked about like if the university is dedicated and made all these commitments to all these things that they are trying to make commitments to, like a just transition and all of that, this is like a vehicle through which for them to do that. And so, Rachel, if you have any more thoughts. Just, I'm trying to articulate my words here, but just the idea that like they could be making returns while solving these problems and committing to all of these and acting on all of these things that they've committed to, I think is one way to kind of approach it.
Yeah, I would say that at UBC, the committee that we would target would be like the sustainability and finance committee. because divestment is under their purview. And so it's really just ongoing, like putting out calls. I'm sure like for folks here who have worked on divestment campaigns, it's really just a waiting game and waiting for Board of Governors to take action. I feel like from my experience, the most effective way is really having one-on-one conversations. I think that's what I've learned from being involved in CJUBC and seeing how Michelle has been able to move divestment along through individual conversations. And a lot of that like educating piece to be done. I can quite confidently tell you that maybe apart from Joel Solomon, no one on the Board of Governors understand how community land trust or co-ops work, and or that they don't actually believe it's a sustainable way. And so similarly to how we have to convince people in power that divestment is an effective strategy, the same type of work has to go behind community investments, fortunately and unfortunately. Yeah.
I just want to say I really like the angle of diversifying risk, because these investments, yeah, they're really like, that's what universities want to do, is to have their portfolio like diversified into a lot of different assets. And if they're missing out community investments, then like that's a whole nother like asset they could be invested in, which is like, it has a different type of risk. It's not like correlated with the rest of the market. So it seems like, or it's more removed from the traditional market. So it seems like it would actually help to kind of like balance out those market fluctuations. And I think that the risk could be, yeah, would be a lot lower than investing in like hedge funds or like venture capital sort of thing. So I think that's a really interesting framing.
Yeah, that one is definitely an interesting one to explore moving forward for sure. It makes sense, especially if you're investing into community and the community wealth is growing, it's like it would act as, theoretically help to act as a buffer against all of those like the inherent crises of capitalism and all of the booms and busts of the more conventional finance framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyone has any more questions? If not, I think we might be good to just end a bit earlier because some folks might have been attending workshops for the whole day. It's a long time on Zoom.
Thank you so much, both of you, for doing the research and for sharing it with us as well.
Thank you guys so much for listening today. It's been exciting. I can't speak for Rachel, but we've been working on this for a while. So it's nice to bounce ideas off of people and get people's thoughts. I've really appreciated today.
I'm just going to put the link to the Google form again, in case you would like to just leave your email so that we can send you some resources that we've put together, as well as the report and the slides as well. And yeah, we'll be continuing to do research in the summer. So if you have any thoughts on what are some parts that can be strengthened or looked into that we didn't address yet, feel free to let us know in the form as well.
All right, I think we will close the room. So thank you guys so much for coming today. And yeah, it's been a great workshop.
Thanks, Anna.